Hi, we're Nia and Marianne from Seren Health Coaching. We are metabolic health coaches who are passionate about good metabolic health for everyone. We also love to chat about all things health and to share as much information as we can with people who want to make changes to their lifestyle but aren't quite sure where to start. We're going to release a new episode every Friday where we talk about a different aspect of health. So do subscribe and let us know what you think. We'd also love to know what you're interested in too. So if there's something that you'd like us to have a chat about, do send us a message and we'll do our best to cover it soon. Hello, Marianne.
Hi, Nia, and what we're talking about today?
Well, let's talk about sugar.
Oh, my favorite.
I just thought it'd be
Yeah,
a really good topic to talk about.
yeah. Who doesn't love sugar?
Mm.
But sugars aren't always simple as they seem. Is anything in nutrition ever simple, mind you? But before
No.
we start, let's just make it clear that we do see sugars as part of our dietary intake, and let's not demonize sugars, per se, but try to understand more about them and how they affect us because it's really important when we're talking about metabolic health.
Yes, I think you're quite right. So we have to be really careful when we talk about sugar that we all have sugar in our diets. We can't actually live a sugar-free life. So all those people who say I quit sugar and I went sugar-free are actually telling you a porky pie because you can't get rid of it. But there are also some hidden sugars that we might not be aware of. So that's sort of what we're kind
Hmm.
of talking about. And what makes it even more complicated is sugars have got lots of different names. So it's not just
Yeah.
sugar.
Yeah.
They occur naturally in fruit, in vegetables. You can manufacture them and put them in processed food, which is what they love to do. Um, some of them are absorbed incredibly quickly and are used for like instant energy. And there's obviously some benefits to that. For example, say you were a type 1 diabetic and you are having a hypo, that's great. You know, you need an instant source of energy. Others take a bit longer as they need to be broken down. Their structure is a bit more complex, so the body needs to break them down. What I don't think many people are aware of is that sugars are part of the carbohydrate family of nutrients,
Mm.
and that includes starches. And starches obviously are potatoes as well as rice and other
Bread.
things, and bread.
Mm.
We can sort of hack them a bit so we can have different combinations of nutrients together, and that will affect how we absorb our sugars.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, depending on where we are in our bodies health wise, metabolically, we can process them differently. So there's a huge load of different things about sugar.
Oh, yeah. So this is why it isn't ever simple. But let's
Yes.
start with the simple bit, shall
Okay.
we? Sugars are a source of energy in our diets. As you say, they can be naturally occurring in fruit, but also manufactured. And I know you always love to recite all the different names for sugar, so off you go.
Okay. So there's glucose, sucrose, sucralose, fructose, dextrose, maltose. Uh, are you bored yet? There's so
You
many.
love it.
I love
You're
it.
such
It's
a
like my party
chemist,
trick.
aren't you?
I know.
You're such a chemist. But getting familiar with these names is a good idea.
Yeah, so I think the reason that I know so many names of sugar is because when you start really looking at things and reading
Yeah,
labels, you
yeah,
are trying to avoid sort of sugars and you're thinking how much sugar is actually in this product. And if you see that it's got
yes.
glucose, then you go a bit further and you read dextrose, and then you see it's got maltose. You're like, oh, hang on, this isn't just one sugar, this is lots of sugar. First of all, just remember that
Yeah,
most sugars end in O's. Sometimes you get things like
yeah.
agave nectar, also a sugar, honey, also a sugar, maple syrup, clues in the name, syrup,
They
sugary.
don't end in O's.
They
Yes.
don't end in O's. So that's the other thing to be
Yeah,
aware of. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so just going back a bit, glucose goes straight into the bloodstream and it's really
Hmm.
useful, obviously, if you're having a hypo, but most of us luckily don't suffer from hypos.
Yeah.
And most other sugars have to be converted. And remember, sugars are also part of the starch story. So, although you might not have actual sugar in that slice of bread, the starches in the bread will eventually be the
Be
same energy in your body. So I think that's one of the things that is quite hard to understand to begin with. Okay,
yes.
let's talk about labels.
Okay. So the important thing when you're reading a label is The higher up the ingredients list something is, the more of it is in the product.
Oh,
The
yeah.
law is that you've got to
Okay.
list the ingredients in order of quantity. So the higher up the
Okay.
list the sugar is, the more sugar is in that food. And for
Yeah.
example, when we did that podcast on those meal replacement things, remember that one? So sometimes, you'd have like I don't know, chicken curry or something, and you read the ingredients and you're wandering along, la 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 la, la, chicken, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got some glucose or some dextrose. And then you've got like the added flavorings. And then inside the flavorings, there's brackets. And then it says dextrose or maltose or
Yes.
maltodextrin.
Uh,
That's quite a common one.
okay.
So it's not just where they are in the list, it's also how many you can identify on a label. And that's really helpful because it helps you identify how much sugar or added sugar is in a food. So that's, one helpful thing. So then another really important thing is that you can try and work out how much sugar is in the food and equate that to teaspoons of sugar, which I think is a really nice
Yeah.
visual representation. And you use that quite a lot, don't you? To help people
I
understand how
really
much
do.
sugar.
It made such a difference to me personally long time
Mm,
ago because it makes sense in my brain to say there's 4 teaspoons of sugar in this portion of something. And once you've got
yes.
that, it's really easy to look at labels, even if you're just, using it as a simple, it doesn't have to be exact. So you don't have to say it's 4.2 teaspoons, 4 teaspoons in this is good enough.
Yeah.
But it does
Yeah.
make a huge difference.
Yeah. So that's like a very interesting sort of side note, but that's kind of helpful practical thing if you're going to the supermarket
Yeah.
and you're picking up your favorite product and you just want to have a look and see actually how much sugar is in this that I didn't know was in this, because sometimes they say no added sugar, and that's a very
Yes,
clever
often.
marketing trick. It does not mean there is no
Yes.
sugar in it at all.
No, exactly. And if you want to know how much, look at your label. Because remember, naturally occurring sugars are still sugars, and the grams per 100 grams are going to really help you. So you've got to look for that column,
Yeah,
100
so we'll
grams.
we'll talk we'll talk about that in a minute, I suppose. So
Okay.
there's another bit, isn't there, that we need to talk about?
Yes. You mean about the chains?
I do mean about the chains, yes, because I think this is
Right. So
probably
this
the
was
bit that you
another
and
thing.
I
Yeah.
found most exciting, but most people don't
Yes.
understand. And I think most people need to understand this because actually, once you get this, it is a bit easier to understand why it's such a
Yes,
problem, isn't it?
exactly. So years ago, when I looked at charts and saw that, for instance, a slice of bread contained the equivalent of 4 teaspoons of sugar in energy,
Mm,
it made me think, well, that's very weird because there's not sugar in the bread.
mm,
I mean, there might be a bit, but that doesn't equate to 4 teaspoons per slice.
no,
But what it means is that the starch molecules are slightly different to sugar molecules, but they're not that different. The molecules themselves are very similar, but they're in chains, and we always think of them as holding hands. So in
yeah,
a slice of bread, your energy in the form of glucose is actually in a starch form, and they're like the sort of dolls holding hands, and
yeah.
they have to be extracted slightly differently. So your body needs to work a bit harder to get the sugar from that slice of bread.
Yeah, so if you think about those paper chain dolls that you get when you make them
Yeah,
for children, so you do that,
yeah,
concertina with the paper, you draw your doll, you bring them out, and they're all holding hands. So if you think of
yeah,
the refined bread, so white bread, your white pasta, your white rice, they've got these chains of glucose molecules holding hands, as you said, like the paper dolls.
yeah,
And if you were to have a chain of paper dolls and you were to try and pull them apart, very quickly you can separate them, can't you? Because they're not made of
yeah,
much. The hands are
yeah,
quite thin and it's easy to tear the paper. So if you think about that
yeah,
in your body, you've had that pasta, it's easy to break those chains down. So very quickly you've had a bowl of pasta and your body releases that energy into sugar really, really fast. And so that's the same for very processed foods as well. It's incredibly quick. So that means that even though you didn't take it in as glucose in its
no,
purest form, you're getting glucose very, very quickly, and that's giving you a big rise in your
okay.
blood sugar. Right.
And that's
But
really critical to understand. Yeah.
yeah, that's really critical to understand. And then you say, okay, so why are you telling me that I should have whole grain bread or wholemeal pasta or use something called a complex carbohydrate? And that's where the information changes slightly. So remember when you were in biology, we talked about the endosperm on the wheat, the outer shell that is around the wheat before you process it. And that's what's in
Hmm.
the whole meal and the whole grain products. They've still got
Right.
that shell. Okay.
Yeah.
You've got to break that down, or the body has got to
Yeah.
break that
To
down
get
to
at
release
the
the energy.
right.
So you've still got those chains. It's exactly the same as in the white bread and the white pasta. The chains are still there, but they're holding hands more tightly. So it's
Yeah.
harder to break that down. So the body needs to work harder to get those molecules out. And because the body's taking such a long time to get that out, it's not an instant release of energy. The sugar that is released into your body is much slower and longer. So you
Right.
get a long release of the energy or prolonged energy
Yeah.
release rather than a quick spike of sugar and then the corresponding release of insulin, which goes down to crash. We've
Yeah.
put some things on our social media actually this week to help understand this because it's really tricky to understand that without seeing it sort of in a
Yeah.
diagram. But ultimately, the less processed your food is in terms of starches and the more fiber it's harder to convert to glucose. So it takes longer to get the energy out. Does that make sense?
So the spikes are lower and slower,
Yes.
and the insulin response is similar. So you will ultimately find that slower, more complex carbohydrates and sugars are less likely to make you hungry afterwards, whereas those sharp spikes with sharp spikes of insulin
Mm,
are more likely, unfortunately, to make you hungry pretty fast, which is
yeah.
why a big bowl of cereal is going to make you hungry about 2 hours later and you can't understand it. And I remember doing exactly that.
Correspondingly, there's not much difference actually between a whole grain piece of bread and a white refined piece of bread in terms of the
Yeah,
amount of sugar, but it's the way that
yeah,
your body processes it that makes
yes.
the difference. If you have the
Okay,
white bread, you're going to get that sharp glucose spike, the corresponding release of insulin, which makes a sharp decline. And insulin's great, isn't it? It brings down your blood sugar. That's what it's meant to do, but
yeah,
it also makes you hungry. So if you had that for
yeah,
breakfast, maybe an hour later, you're hungry, you're finding yourself eating more. But if you have the whole
yeah,
grain toast with some healthy fats and protein and all the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about, it's a slower, longer energy release, like a prolonged release tablet, for example. And you're going to get to lunch without that corresponding spike and
right.
trough of insulin
So,
that makes you hungry.
and that's incredibly useful when you think about it.
Yes.
Okay, so remember, if you remember nothing else about what we've just said, is that sugar comes in all forms, it's absorbed and you respond to it differently depending on many factors. But remember, 4 grams of sugar equals 1 teaspoon, and that's really useful when you're trying to look at
Food
labels.
labels. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and you might have to do some very simple maths, but it's really not difficult. So if you remember 4 grams is 1 teaspoon, and you work out how many grams in this product under that 100 ml mark or 100 grams, and then you look at your portion size, don't forget, and you sort of times it up. So it's pretty easy maths.
The other thing to say is that what you're looking for on your label is to work out the sugars. So it will say protein, fat, carbohydrates, and then it says of which sugars. So the important part is of which sugars. So you had a bottle of kefir, didn't you, the other day?
I did. Yeah.
And it had how much carbs?
Right. So I bought a bottle of kefir, which I thought, by the way, was pretty healthy stuff because I think it said great for gut health and low in sugars or natural sugars or whatever.
Mm,
And when I was drinking it, it had 6.9 grams of carbs of which
Yep.
5.2 were sugars in 100 mils, and I drank
Okay.
250 mils. So you do the maths, right?
Yep.
In that little bottle of kefir, which is, considered a health product, it
Yep.
contained 13 grams of sugar, which is equivalent to 3 teaspoons.
So
3 teaspoons of sugar in a tiny bottle of kefir, which I would never have dreamt would contain that much sugar.
mm,
Um, and your body doesn't differentiate between natural sugars, remember? So even though that might have been apple juice or whatever,
yeah,
you're still getting the sugar. So if you remember nothing else about this and you're not mad about maths, just remember 4 grams
is a teaspoon.
of
Yeah.
sugar is 1 teaspoon. That really helps because I think you visualizing the teaspoons is really important.
I think
Yeah.
most people know that you shouldn't add sugars to your diet. So we're talking about added sugars, like people say, don't add any sugar
Mm,
to your coffee and your tea and things like that. But you don't appreciate that
yeah,
just in those foods that are labeled as no added sugar, there's still that much more. And just because it came
exactly.
from fruit or from honey or from agave nectar, your body doesn't care. It's still going to use it in
No,
exactly the same way. Okay. When we said at the beginning that we're not demonizing sugar, we really do mean it. So we're not trying to blame you for
no.
or make you feel guilty about what you're eating in terms of sugar. What we're saying is awareness is the first thing. What can we do differently? And the good news is that
Yeah,
there's loads of really simple things we can do differently.
exactly.
And it's just about knowing a bit more. So remember that your bread label might not say sugars, but it will say carbs. And that is obviously converted to glucose to
Mm,
sugar. Fascinatingly, when you think about it in a bit more detail, you look at things like breakfast cereals. So 30 grams of Cocoa Pops is 7 teaspoons of sugar.
that's hard to believe.
Mm, but it is when it's broken down.
And so that's not just sugar, that's also simple starches, and that's the
Hmm.
problem that you're not talking just about sugars, but those simple starches are going to be those chains that come undone and they are exactly the same as sugar. So
So
that 30
super
grams, which
fast.
by the way is tiny, a
Yeah, I
tiny
mean, I've
bowl of
never,
Cocoa
ever,
Pops.
ever measured out 30 grams of cereal. Have you? Actually, no, I tell you that I have done it
I
once
have. I have, and
because
it's
I did it for
shocking. So
Special
it's
K.
quite small.
Yeah.
Yes, Special K. Oh, shouldn't mention that. But
Well, do you remember we
if your kids are helping themselves to their Cocoa Pops, they might well be having 50 to 60 grams, which you're now talking about something really awful, like
like,
14 teaspoons of
yeah.
sugar.
So, and then if you consider that, so for a healthy breakfast, right, a lot of people will give their child cereal and a smoothie
Yeah.
or a fruit juice. So if you
Or
add all of
toast.
that up, or
Yeah.
and toast, yeah. So if you add that all up, that's quite a startling amount of sugar to start the day with. No wonder we're all buzzing.
No wonder the teachers are all complaining about, the spiky children who you wouldn't realize, but sugar spikes at that rate have huge consequences for us
Yeah.
in all sorts of interesting ways. One is just that you've got a corresponding insulin spike to control the sugar, and that
Mm,
that insulin spike, remember, if you remember nothing else either, is that insulin is the hunger hormone and
mm,
it's also a great fat storer.
mm.
So,
So
when you think, golly, I'm much better at storing fat than someone else, this isn't fair, it's possibly because have got higher insulin levels, and you also get used to higher insulin levels and you become less sensitive to that insulin. We call this
yeah,
insulin resistance. That's a whole nother podcast, but it's a really important part of the story.
it is.
Okay.
So if you think about it, we almost think about these excess sugars as like a sugar shock.
Interesting, but if you're having that every day, like you're giving children, or you're having cereals every morning with toast and marmalade and a bit of orange juice, which is not an unusual
Unusual
breakfast in this
breakfast? No.
country, you're getting that buzz so often that your body adjusts the thresholds of that buzz. And
Yeah.
that's what insulin resistance is really. You become immune to the shouting of the insulin, and so your body tries to make more insulin to get its message into the cells.
Mm,
And it's a really important part of the sugar story. It's never
yeah.
simple, any of this, is it? That's
No,
the
no, it's
problem.
never simple. So if you think about Paddington Bear, he's probably very insulin resistant. All those marmalade sandwiches.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Okay. But what about if you, the next bit of this complicated story is what if you mix your sugars up with proteins and fats? How does that help
So
or not?
yeah. So that is probably the second most important part of this podcast actually
Yep.
is just so firstly awareness of how much sugar is in stuff, and secondly what can I do about it so that I don't get all of these
Yep.
sugar spikes,
Yep.
and that I do keep my sensitivity to insulin, which is so important. So it turns out
Yes.
if we mix macronutrients so that we have some healthy fats, some protein, and some
Yep.
fiber, not all necessarily all in one go, but as many as you can get,
Yep.
it will slow the spike of the sugar.
Ah,
So
yes.
it
Okay.
means that your body takes longer to get the energy out,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that sugar release is more steady. So you don't get the peaks and troughs.
Yep.
You just get a nice steady
And
release
then
of
you
energy.
don't get the insulin response in the same way
Exactly. The
either.
insulin
Yep.
response is much less. You don't get the hunger, you don't get the fat storage to the
Yes.
same extent. So
Yes.
all of this kind of takes you off that sugar roller coaster and gives you like a nice peaceful ride, which is
Who knew
ideally
that
what
it
you
was
want.
so easy? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's so easy, really, if you know. So
exactly. If you
if you
know.
ate an egg on toast, say, which is what
Yeah.
I do sometimes, and then keep a little bit of toast for my very special bit of homemade marmalade, which is my treat. But because I've eaten the protein and the fat with the carbohydrates already,
Hmm.
that little bit of marmalade on my toast is not going to give me the same spike or insulin response as it would have had I not had the
The
egg
egg
and the
first.
healthy fats
Yeah.
first. So
Yeah,
the mix of
absolutely.
how you eat sugars is also really crucial. If you're going to eat sugars, eat them at the end of meals where you've eaten other. Yeah,
Yeah. So that's why, it's fine to have pudding occasionally. Like we
yeah,
should obviously we shouldn't
yeah,
be having pudding every day perhaps, but if you are at a special
yeah.
occasion and you've had a really lovely meal and then you think actually I really would like a pudding, then that's not going to spike your blood sugar in the same way as it would have done had you had that for your starter, for example.
And interestingly, if you, like me, used fruit as a snack, because, we thought fruit was very healthy, which it sort of is,
Mm,
if you ate your fruit after your lunch, say, and you'd had some other proteins and fats and fiber,
yeah.
you wouldn't get the same spike as if you wait till the mid-afternoon and then fill yourself with 3 pieces of fruit, which gives you quite a huge spike. Because
Mm,
although there's healthy fiber and other things in whole fruit, by the way, so let's not demonize whole fruit, you're still going to get a bigger spike then than you would have got if you'd eaten it after your meal. So I would say
mm.
that's why we say try not to snack between meals and eat sugars, whether naturally occurring or not, after a protein, fat,
Yeah.
fiber
Or
meal
or with it. So
or
if for
with.
example
Yeah.
you are going to have a banana, one of the easiest ways to
Yeah.
change the way that you eat a banana is to just have it with some Greek yogurt, some nuts and seeds.